على ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sticks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Vlog, and this is a Varn Vlog solo. And today I'm going to be talking about many things, and we're going to start off with Matt Stollers, the Cantillon effect, and the stock market crashes. And we're going to do a little bit of economic analysis. Now, Stollers' politics is not mine, but he makes many valid points about a few things. And I'm going to use this also as an educational moment to clarify what I mean when I say certain things. Because when people hear me talk about the declining rate of profits in real commodities, right? By that I mean physical things which are traded without intellectual property restrictions or other forms of severe IP or rentier modeling. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute. People think I mean, oh, well, there's less money to be made in the system. And actually, I'm not even implying that. All right. Real commodities are physical things that we use to build the world. And their prices tend to drop. That's why there's been so much investment in intellectual property, because it secures up price ratios. And there's also why there's been so much monopolization. As individual profits drop in real commodities, they get gobbled up by larger companies, leading to the monopolization of the market. This was observed all the way back in Marx's time. It's crucial to understanding classical political economy, even before Marx. And it's even talked about. I was reading passages from Ibn Khaldun, of all places, where he talks about this trait in national markets in the 14th century. All right. So this is something that happens over time. Competition drives profits down within a limited market if there's a real commodity at plan and you don't have anything else to boost up those profits. Now, what can boost up profit? Well, the first is labor productivity. The second is raising prices, but again, raising prices, if you do it throughout the system, actually devalues the currency, meaning that it becomes a Red Queen game. You have to raise prices more to recoup the same amount of profits that you were recouping by raising prices priorly. And such your real profit rate actually drops, even though your nominal profits may look to go up. But the other way to do this is market capture. And you market capture through rents, intellectual property, and other limitations on trade. Now, what Stoller gets at in the article, which is going to be in the show notes here, is actually really important for understanding this. We've been having gangbusters years in nominal profits, particularly during COVID. And we've been increasing investment into non-commodity assets, our speculative assets. Now, this has been a trend that goes in cycles since the financialization of the economy in the 1970s in the developed world. But this financialization is now thoroughgoing and nearly planetary. All right. And you see this in even the distribution of where workers are. I was pointing out to a bunch of people who are arguing about the blue collar working class being the real working class that the blue collar working class in the developed world is between like, and by blue collar I mean people who work in manufacturing, logistics, and other physical labor who draw a wage, who are not petit bourgeois, meaning they don't own their own equipment and thus are not contract workers. And blue collar in American terminology conflates that with petit bourgeoisie who do the same thing, like the plumber who owns his business versus the plumber who's employed, right? That's confusing. Or the general contractor versus the construction worker who is employed by a company. Now, let's talk about what all that means, because if you look at employment in blue collar sectors, according to the Department of Labor Statistics in the United States, it's less than 14% of the overall people who draw a wage. Whereas white collar work is about, and that's a quotation, so this is people who work in desk job servicing, information logistics, coding, etc. It's about 41% of the economy, and the rest of it's in services, which is neither. I've also pointed out that raw production is even less than the blue collar sector. It is something like 9 to 11% of the economy. Now, and the developed in the United States, and I think these trends hold with slightly different ratios in Europe. Agriculture, for example, is like less than 2% of the economy. So when we imagine these workers or whatever, and we have the image of like the 1950s industrial laborer in a factory, or the blue collar mechanic, like my dad, actually. My dad, my dad's a mechanic. That's not the majority of the labor force. Okay, why does that matter? Well, people who service real things and who make real things are a smaller and smaller part of the economy because of automation. To put it in Marxist terms, the socially necessary labor time to produce something is dropped by automation. And that means you can produce more with less labor. Still need labor in there somewhere to keep all the machines going. There's no AI supercomputer that, if it actually existed, would effectively be a person as far as economic counting. If it could do what people could do and have personal agency, that doesn't exist yet. So we have factories that are increasingly automated, and this automation was already scaring people who from the traditional labor movement as early as the 1960s. All right. And this is, you can read someone like Andre Gorst talking about this in the 1970s and 80s, and that's before digitization and computer automation. That's just mechanical automation and basic robotics. All right. Once you understand that, we understand how, we hit the profitability crisis in the 1970s. There's a bunch of conflating factors. Sometimes there's too easy of a story around it. But basically, the oil shock of the 1970s dipped profits into zero because the amount of energy that it took to maintain some of these things was just not viable in the developed world. That is when you began to see outsourcing and then the fiscalization of the economy. Now, what Stoller gets at is something I got at in my interview with Dr. Clyde Burrow about what Marx talked about finance capital in specific and the lumpinization of the economy, which are the non-productive sectors of the economy, things that don't produce anything but gobble things up. All right. Most of your nouveau riche tech billionaires, they're not productive. All right. They're not producing a physical commodity. They're creating platforms. And while those platforms do increasingly create the ability for petit bourgeois trade or whatever to happen, what they actually also do is shut out other competition. So this makes investment non-productive. You can't just invest in highly, in physical commodity production and get a return that's worth a shit. You're not going to outpace inflation. And this is where Stoller's article comes in. Stoller points out that the fiscalization of the economy and the monopolization of those fiscal instruments and these non-physical or semi-physical industries. Now, when I say like the internet is non-physical, it's actually not true. The internet is a massive energy sink. All right, so we should be careful about thinking about it non-physically. And there's a reason why, even the internet development in like other parts of the world is highly dependent on these massive energy farms being somewhere and coordinated by someone else on this international scale. So we shouldn't think of that totally non-physically. They are like, in fact, it's kind of just like any other fetish that we talk about in economics. The actual physical infrastructure and the amount of energy it takes is largely hidden from you. But let's go back into this. Production generates surplus used by capitalists, but fiscal speculation just subtracts out from that surplus. Now, this was an assumption not just in Marx's classical economy. Excuse me, I said neoclassical, and that's not true. But it's an assumption in Adam Smith and in Ricardo and even in the American founding fathers. If you talk about like the way, say, John Adams felt about speculation, you see that there was this hatred of finance capital that even the early bourgeoisie in the United States had a fear of. And the reason why is they saw it as not producing anything. Yes, you needed finance capital to enable some production to happen, to give businesses liquidity so they could hire this or that on credit, to change timeframes, etc. But speculation would drive the price up and down, destabilizing the markets. Well, in the neoliberal turn between the late 1960s and into 1980, where it's really codified, the fiscalization of the economy really accelerates. And then when you add the internet and seemingly making most of our information technologies non-physical, and notice I said seeming, you have an acceleration of this process. There's also the fact that IPs and rents become something more important to the economy than classical economists could imagine. None of the classical economists dealt with a state that had the surveillance capacity strong enough to enforce something like digital rights management or constantly hounding people who counterfeit intellectual property or maintaining seemingly internal patent law. All right, that requires an absurdly strong state from the 19th century vantage point. We live in a time period where the state is clearly that strong because of its relation to capital. Now, my friends, this brings us to Stoller. And I'm going to quote Stoller here because Stoller makes a point that in all the great realignments that we've seen since 2008, supposedly, from Obama's Hope and Change to Trump's Make America Great Again to Biden's return to normalcy, we've been giving people nothing but hope, speculative markets, and oxycodone. So much that it's even lowered the average American's life expectancy. While we've seen some mild life expectancy increases in certain minority groups, what we've seen is a decrease in the overall life expectancy, particularly in the, quote, white working class, whatever the fuck that means. And this is during the time period that we have seen since 2008. The 2007 crash revitalized Marxism, but the Marxism that it's revitalized ultimately has had few answers for this because people are in many ways so specialized in their knowledge they can't put the bigger picture together. They aren't looking at enough different things at the same time. Now, while someone might be interested in modern monetary theory and talk about how nominally you can't run out of currency and currency generates spending, you can use that spending to make more productive. You could have the government be the stopgap final employer, thus raising wages. You could have it, if it purchase more, negotiate prices down on the private market. Some emitters will claim that it already does this. I have never seen evidence that supports that. The price of milk is not because of the government's buying power, but regardless, they do have some points there. But that's only looking at one node of the overall economy and pretending that node explains everything. It explains a lot. It explains a lot of why this deficit hawk stuff shouldn't worry people. But what we see now, what Stoller points out is, yes, the fiscalization of the economy seems fine until you start seeing the physical commodities area start breaking down. When you can't get baby formula because it's been monopolized by 3 companies and one shutdown causes a massive crisis, when you can't get transistors for cars, when are for computers, when you can't get, because it's been monopolized, been affected by just-in-time supply chains, which, by the way, if you study that, those were based off of, just-in-time supply chains were based off of people who created software, right? The idea that you would run physical commodity chains on the same notion is just idiotic, and yet our economy has been encouraged to go that way as an efficiency-saving mechanism, mostly on the cost of storing and maintaining surplus. We don't want to warehouse anything because that actually takes people and stuff to do. Just like cleaning a database takes energy and someone to go and clean the database, so does it take to maintain a warehouse. So Stoller points out that during this time period, we've seen increased monopolization. And the last time we've seen this really been come down upon in these rent-seeking tech companies was during the 1990s when there was an attempt to break up Microsoft. Since then, you pretty much have legislative capture. And then Stoller points out some more terrifying things. That even the CARES Act, for all its supposed progressiveness, was a big corporate giveaway in a lot of ways. It stabilized housing markets over rent markets. You had a massive dumping into very inefficient and scammy small business loans. You had a bunch of subsidies that kept these rent-seeking things expanding, and you saw that boost the stock market at a time where logically it should not have done so. And at the time, even I was kind of blindsided by it. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. Now it's clear to me that what it did was while instead of reinvesting in the general public, breaking up monopolies or nationalizing them, you had a stabilization of the markets through market effects like QE, which caused people to think that the investment environment was infinitely safe, that there was no risk. And you saw increased investment for high profit yields into essentially bullshit, like cryptocurrencies, NFTs, things that anyone should go look at and go, well, this is almost inevitably going to be a pump and dump scam. It doesn't produce anything, right? You're not generating to the general wealth fund with this. And both Republican and Democratic policy has been unwilling or unable to do a damn thing about it. And in so much that the Republicans kind of have tilted that way, it's only been to spite the political ambitions of some of the media companies. It's madness. It forgoes 200 years of basic economic understanding. Because what it means is monopolies have been allowed to control more and more of the state, basically backed by the federal governments of the world. All right? It is not any mistake that all these companies that are coming out in the top, in the Fortune 500 top, 10 companies, Amazon, Tesla, etc., were all insulated by a mixture of fiscal capital investments for people looking for some new way to get high returns since the traditional commodities market wasn't yielding it, and direct government investment and protection. And the people who think you can pursue the Democrats to break these monopolies up, re-regulate markets, are foolish because they're completely dependent on the funds that they're allowing by policy to be thrown into these mega corporations to be fed back to them in the form of donations. That's what keeps these Congress people afloat. And this is why I've always laughed at things like the DSA, the Democratic Socialist strategy of like trying to pick small candidates, endorse them, and back them up with funds, because there's no way in hell they can compete on the funds level with these other players. And just basic game theory tells you that is a losing proposition. You will never win. That's why I disagree with Stoller. Stoller says we could fix all this and take care of the people who are going to get hurt by this downturn, and we need the downturn to clear out these bullshit markets that are sucking up this this currency and just evaporating it into nothing and not turning into useful production. Whether or not you believe in Keynesian economics or MMT or whatever, you can see the problem here. It really has been socialization for the rich, privatization for the poor. As dumb as that slogan is, and it is dumb, by the way, that is really part of what is going on. What is also going on is physical commodity profits are so low and no one has figured out a way to return them the profitability that actually investing in productive economic activity isn't profitable for most people. So all these profits are basically compounding fictitious capital. They aren't real. They could be real. This currency could be invested in actual production. All right. I'm not saying that we needed to have like commodity money or something for this to work, but you actually have to make stuff to increase wealth. Now, we can go about all the other problems. I'm not even dealing with climate change in this. I said to Dr. Clive Barrow that the unproductive forces of capital won the battle with the productive forces. And Stoller's article with economic statistics points that out. And the only way we're going to get rid of it and get control of that is by taking a lot of things away. And let's be honest, this recession that is finally trying to smack down on some of this is also engineered. It is unlikely to immediately drop inflation, but it will probably lead to more unemployment, which means that the reactionary forces are going to start to be able to capitalize on that and capitalize on the American general ignorance of the way the economy actually works. I always see when people bring up, for example, forgiving student loans, and I have my own problem with the stunt of just forgiving student loans by fiat through Biden not reforming the student loan program, not reforming universities top down over administrative nature, not reforming the whole neoliberal university in the first place. Because if you don't do that, then just forgiving the loans is a one-time fix for a certain group of people, and it's just going to come back again and again and again. And it will eventually have moral hazard. Nor would I think just making the colleges free with their current massive endowments and everything actually do much, particularly since it would be unlikely that they would actually go in and restructure the administration in such a way that the administration wouldn't protect its jobs over faculties and the actual, function of the fucking university. So even the fixes you see at the Democrats aren't going to give you anyway, let's be honest. aren't enough. But then I see the responses to it, which is like, well, you signed the loan, then then you owe the money. Well, the interest rates are secured, and in the United States, you can't default on those student loans. You cannot. I mean, you can default on them, but you can't declare bankruptcy on them, and they will be paid to the private sector, even if they're paid by the government, and you will be punished. And so there are laws, floated by Republicans that aren't going to get through right now to make anyone who's not currently on, going to be forgiven under public service loans or IBR unforgivable and undischargeable without making college loans dischargeable by bankruptcy or forgiving the interest. So they basically lock in the inflating problem forever. So you have two groups in the United States who have no incentive to make policy that would fix this situation. There is not an incentive, and you're not going to force it by the vote. You can't even hold the squad accountable to basic principles that it supposedly agrees to on the Progressive Caucus, whether it's expanding the security state domestically, which the squad has largely endorsed, or whether it's increasing the military budget and $40 billion for to be funneled into Ukraine. None of that does any socialist hold them accountable for, despite the DSA International Committee finger waving about it with some fucking statement no one's going to care about. Even the reformists of us are beginning to see that the fiscalization of our economy is basically at the expense of the productive capacity of our economy. If you are a person who makes things right now, you're fucked. If you're a person who survives off of rents, you're probably fucked also because of this market correction that the Fed has imposed on you temporarily by raising our meager interest rates. But the fact that these meager interest rate raises are having this much of an effect tells you a lot, doesn't it? The financialization of our economy and the techno-neo-feudalism that you currently hear talked about is both kind of real, but ultimately is built on a house of cards. And you start seeing how this fictitious capital just dumps when you start seeing the breakdown of productive capacity. And we are seeing it. That's why it's hard to get fucking formula. This is what I mean by we need to talk. This is what I mean by we need to start building our own power and going it alone. I don't just mean we need to start our own new party. All right. I'm going to say something that's important to say. If you want to replace the professional managerial strata, all right, if you don't want a bunch of managers functioning as a de facto or de jure class, a de jure class is the wrong way of saying it, but a de facto class that has its own interests, then you have to skill large parts of the labor force in skills that they're probably not going to be that interested in learning immediately because it doesn't immediately affect them unless they have more control over their own lives. This is also true for democratization. If you outsource democracy to representatives and they outsource it increasingly to think tanks and loons, who are their primary base, who are highly motivated to take part in special elections and other small local things where the elderly and the highly motivated have an advantage, then you're going to have an increasingly unresponsive representative system no matter what you do, right? Even stuff like first past the post vote, getting rid of first past the post voting, excuse me, not promoting it, we already have it, won't totally fix that. If you want people to make smart democratic decisions, you have to have skin in the game, and to have them have skin in the game is you have to have their direct policy decisions to actually have repercussions. And in most states, they don't. or they're protected in somewhat dysfunctional states like California. All right. If we continue to encourage investment, private investment in things that are going to lead to a high yield, even there, reform's not possible. What you have is capture by a certain sector of elites, then the spilling out into the general public, then it leading to inflation, and it leading to more capture and political dysfunction. And even from a capitalist perspective, not even from my socialist one, this is an unviable way to go. But that's where we're all headed, and it's not just in the United States. The United States is just where it's most advanced. And if you want to be terrified, look at the food market right now. Because the thing that keeps us alive is going to start having problems. And you're going to see it really start to manifest in the developing world. This is why countries like India and China are barring their grain from trade, because they need to import to make things work. And they don't have enough. Places like the United States do, but it's going to lead to price instability, and you're going to be damn well sure it's going to hit the poor before anyone else. This is a failing society. People who tell you otherwise are in basic delusion. This is even failing by capitalist standards, which is what Stoller really points out. You have non-productive capital dominating over productive capital because the profit margins in productive capital are too low. The profits that you see flowing throughout the systems are from rents, intellectual property, which is compelled markets, and IP. Neoliberalism has been a bait and switch, pretending that we were going back to the early, laissez-faire markets of the 19th century, which themselves were not very as laissez-faire as they were ever perceived. The state had to do enclosures and take land and encourage primitive accumulation and enslave or dispossess tons of people. And it was done by a state, but it was still a relatively small state compared to now. The irony of neoliberalism is it takes an even larger state to do that than it did to even do Fordism or Keynesian social democracy. You have a massive state sector in almost all the planet, but instead of it being somewhat socialized in its ability to provide goods and welfare, it's been privatized or it's been hidden in military Keynesianism and using disability as a substitute for welfare. In 1,000 things. It's been clugged and kludged together. It doesn't fucking work anymore. It's too complex for anyone to control. And it's too monopolized too. Look at the software that these people produce for you. Look at Facebook and compare it to LiveJournal. I made this point in an interview I did with Avery of Ideas Shop that's going to be available to my Patreons very soon. This will go out to the public very soon. But LiveJournal is easier to use its archive feature than Facebook. Why? Facebook code tries to do too much with too many people with too much input all the time, and it loses information. Databases and warehouses, as I said, take energy, resources, and personnel to maintain. Even with an algorithm that's very complicated, cleaning the data and making sure that the algorithm's clean takes people and expertise. It's breaking down, even in terms of code. The wrecking ball is coming, and we need it to come. Not because I'm an accelerationist. I am very afraid of politically what's going to happen because the left tied its wagon to the Democratic Party and didn't do what it needed to do to reform that party. It tried a shortcut. That shortcut was hoping that the presidency of Bernie Sanders would happen, or even if it failed, would force the Democrats into some reformist reliance. But they didn't do anything to fix the local level Democratic Party machines because they weren't empowered or even know how to do so. In some ways, the left tried one neat trick to fix the problem. Now, the right's doing it too, by the way. And trust me, well, who knows what we're going to see in the presidential election in 2 years. Like, God knows that I am not going to try to predict that as well as things have been. I can tell you it'll be destabilizing, and I can tell you that no party right now has anything like the policies necessary to fix the problem. Despite supposed realignments, the fundamental leadership has not changed. The swamp doesn't seem to be able to be drained, nor is it able to be repaired. No one's fixing the levees either. I saw today on Facebook another stupid debate, and I saw it on Twitter too, about, people telling people not to sleep with comrades. And while I think that may be overstated, the response to it is protesting needs to be fun. It needs to be about joy. And my response to it is very simple. Never trust someone who encourages hedonism in someone else, but not in the class they're fighting. We need self-discipline. All right? Yes, things can be fun. Yes, we can have joy. Yes, we can have relationships. It's foolish to pretend not to. But when you're actually doing the work, whatever that is, you probably need to be sober, clean-minded, and almost military-like in your approach. Yeah, look, my Heinrichian friends, I'm going to say this. Heinrich's right about the argument in Marx. All right? The argument for why Marx gives for why profits fall does not apply to the modern economy the way it is written about machines and this, that, and the other. I mean, that's part of it, but that's not really all that's driving this. Real, and it's also very important to note that I'm limiting my claim to real commodities, physical commodities, not branded commodities that have patent protections, not intellectual property, not anything that involves rents, which is an increasingly big part of the economic equation. Right? That's the shift. That's what obscures everything. And Marx didn't see that coming because the states that he saw had no capacity to do what they can do now. Just like, for example, Lenin's description of imperialism holds before the nuclear bomb, but after the nuclear bomb, it doesn't hold no more. Technology affects the material world. It affects both modes of production and relations of production if you have to speak at such an abstract level. We need to be gearing up for what this means. And yes, I do think we're going to need a lot more than Marx in our theoretical arsenal. We need to understand complex systems. We need to understand that most of our models have hidden assumptions in the metaphors and analogies we use in them. We need to understand that those metaphors and analogies actually have material or physical manifestations. They change the way we organize ourselves and thus build the world. And we're going to have to be a lot more militant and a lot more disciplined because stuff is only going to get harder. It's easy to be a prophet of doom. That's not what I'm coming in here and ranting these things for. It's harder to start building. What do you need to do? You need to start building resilient networks. You need to start looking at real commodity production. You need to start understanding how all these things interrelate, and you're going to have to reskill large parts of the population and teach them skills they've never known, both practical skills and abstract theoretical ones. And you also have to fight against the alienation in modern society, because we leave solidarity often on the table, because the things that build solidarity, build exposure, build community, we don't do as leftists either. Right? This is where the joy comes in, not when you're protesting. And fuck, most protests don't work anyway. But social unionizing, community organizing, party building does require social functions, real in-person social functions. But you have to have the discipline and instill the skills that we can turn that off. And even if we were going to go about this electorally in the developed world, if we're going to succeed, we have to be more disciplined than our enemies. Not just our ideological enemies, but our class ones, because they have a bigger monetary and power advantage. And the only way you're going to overcome that is cohesiveness and smarter organization. And that requires people having more skills, more interrelated knowledge, more supports than they currently have. And I personally don't want to wait for things to get as bad as they get in, say, Gaza or Lebanon, where dual power strategies really work, because all of the state sectors have completely fucking failed. The human cost of that is too high. But we're finding some of the largest monopolizations of power and currency that have ever existed in human history. And with a political class that is both overeducated and overspecialized, with an inability to see things for the broad picture, and an incentive to appeal to a populace's more moral responses and baser natures, thus having no long-term strategy or goals. It is not because the general public is stupid. It is because smart people are incentivized to only know what they need to know and nothing more. But over time, the cost of that is way, way, way too high. We don't need to be making these arguments off of a theoretical basis. We don't need to be making these arguments off of textual exegesis. We have the evidence in front of us right now. We need to be better. We need to quit trying to do it the easy way, to opportunistically take advantage of a social trend, or to try to hitch ourselves up to one of the currently existing political groups, because those political groups are failing. We need to quit pretending that we live in a world that we don't live in. We need to do the social organizing. We need to talk to the people we live in. We need to be handling alienation. But we also, frankly, need to be getting and trying to deal with the opioid epidemic, the suicide epidemic. We need to be talking to the crisis of alienation. And we need to be speaking where the only other people speaking are our ideological and class opponents. And we don't need to be letting bullshit electoral politicians take our steam away anymore. Unless we are willing to hold them accountable by every means necessary. I am not a total abstentionist electorally. I say, vote on things that you need to do in a protective way. Vote against bad policy. But if we're not even going to hold our candidates to that, then I don't even know what the purpose of that is. Because if things continue the way they're going, and if the Fed engineers this crash to clear out all the fictitious capital that's bleeding out into inflation finally, and we don't pick up the pieces afterwards, well, I'm going to go good old lobster man here and tell you the truth. If we get to that point, you're going to need a lot more than cleaning your bed. You might need to clean your gun. And given the current geopolitical instability and the likelihood that climate change stuff is piling upon us, if we allow things to go that far, well, I'm not even sure that we're talking about failure just on a level of a society. We might be talking about species-wide failure. And I'm not saying that to put, a fire underneath your ass, because people have been doing that for a long time and it doesn't work. Right? I'm saying it because for all this left resurgence, really, what has it led to yet? I have trouble telling people that this uptick in unionization, right? In Starbucks and in that one Amazon factory in in New York, is not actually even undoing the decline of unionization that happened during COVID. Like I've said today, I found a quote that I wrote many years ago, and I think it's more true, and it's something we're going to have to fight. That clarifying people's dream for them is often resented more than denying their dreams. But we got to clarify those dreams. We've been playing around for a decade in this left resurgence, feeding ourselves self-flattering knowledge. And I know you can't hold up a mirror to somebody and show them themselves and them accept it. Actually, there's study after study on that. So we have to think about that too. But we have to take a real assessment of where we're at and how to get better. Because while self-delusion is damning, those of us who look at ourselves too hard, only see the negative and collapse in denialism, well, if we're going to make the metaphor work, those people die faster than even the people who are deluded. I've seen mounds of trash on the edge of the Sahara Desert. I've seen whole villages built out of trash, actually. Even in parts of the developed world, I saw some of this stuff, the debris. But the ecological shaming committed by the green movement didn't change a bit of that. In fact, probably made it worse. Sold a bunch of bromads about recycling and enclosed systems as if entropy didn't exist, and you know, and frankly, conservatives have been able to capitalize on that, because they can point out that like recycling is largely a scam, and it is, by the way. So, you know, then they'll cost down on all these other things. If you've been to the developing world, yeah, it's a little bit more obvious, but even there, you can live in a bubble. I remember living in Mexico, you know, and Mexico's, you know, it's not even one of the worst places as far as I lived in far as this regard, but you could go into shopping malls that are nicer than anything you see in America. And yet, you know, you could go down to any ranchero and see people living off about $20 a week. Maybe, I think the minimum wage is a little bit higher than that, but not much. In many ways, it's chickens coming home to roost, but in another way, we have to admit, this has also been engineered so people didn't see it. Now it's breaking down and you can see it. And one nation, one country can't fix this. I mean, that's the other problem that I have, right? We're not going to fix this in just the United States. We're not going to fix it with just you know, the CPC at the helm in China. I read an article where Kenneth Galbraith was talking about how China needed to form a kind of counter currency as a reserve currency, you know, of non-alike countries, and then the U.S. needed to do something with its currency, and it was all smart, but it totally ignored the political incentives for China to do that. It would actually be giving up a lot of its internal currency power, and why the hell would it ever do that? Right? There was just, and then also it just pretended that what Russia was, because it had the mineral capacity, had the industrial capacity to just turn on its consumer goods overnight. You know, Khrushchev warned the USSR, and some of these policies actually go back to that time, that once they developed a nuclear bomb, that they needed to focus their production capacity on manufacturing goods, and Andropov and Brezhnev, etc., really up until the end of Gorbachev, ignored it. Maintained most of their industry in extraction and weaponry. And when the oligarchs took over, that wasn't changed. And when Putin consolidated the oligarchs into United Russia and his own power base, it still didn't change. And while some of it may change by nationalizations and requisitions of external, you know, productive forces within Russia, they weren't like, there wasn't a ton of factories there producing consumer goods in Russia. Most of the consumers there are specialty and luxury goods that are made for export, and that kind of puts Russia in a weird situation. And Russia can't fulfill the consumer of last resort for China's productive base either. It just doesn't have enough people to do so. And so I'm seeing even a lot of people of the left, a lot of economic thinkers, still try to sell people on stuff that isn't true to flatter their political will and their notions about how the world works. I'm sorry, but anyone who does that to us should be treated as a charlatan and a traitor. And if we still tarred and feathered people, we should do that. Anyway, this is a long, angry rant. People should read the Mark Stoller article. And I think I think this Fed engineered recession is going to have a double-edged sword. It's going to clearing out a lot of this fictitious capital, but what we do afterwards and how we rebuild, I don't trust the current politicians to do it. They're the people who led us here. And the counter-systemic force right now is largely on the right, and it's gone batshit. I've said it before. I'll say it again. There aren't any adults in the room. If we're going to survive, we're going to have to become them. Over and out, guys. Thanks for listening.